Hey ISMIR, good afternoon, and I'm very excited to present you today a way for reformulating the soft dynamic time warping laws, where we provide insights into target artifacts and prediction quality. My name is Johannes Zeitler. I'm a PhD student working at the International Audio Labs in Erlangen under the supervision of Meinard Müller. Let's start with a relatively common MIR task where we have an input recording and want to train a transcription model. And the transcription model should, for every time frame in the audio, predict a representation that contains the probability for note activity. In the example throughout this presentation, the input sounds like this. Now, in order to train such a transcriber, we typically need a large amount of labeled training data. And typically, we use strong targets that have a frame-wise correspondence to the audio and to the prediction. So our strong targets for the example sound like this. Now, as these targets correspond to the audio on the frame level, we can use a classical element-wise loss to train the network, such as MSE or binary cross-entropy. So training with these targets is very precise, and we get relatively good prediction results. But the question is, where do we get those targets from for real recordings? Of course, in the case of piano music, we can perform on a disc clavier and save the corresponding MIDI, which is a representation of such strong targets. But what happens if we want to train on historic recordings or on full orchestral symphonies? In this case, we would have to manually annotate every note event, which is, of course, infeasible in practice, at least for a university. So let's choose a different approach. Let's only annotate global segment boundaries in the input audio and in the musical score. And at least in Western classical music, we can be sure that the recording is performed exactly as it is written by the score. So from the score, we obtain information about which notes are played and in which order they are played. What we don't obtain is the precise duration of each note. For example, there might be a ritardando or a fermata. And that's why we call those targets that we derive from the score weak targets, because they only globally correspond to the input audio, but they may have local timing differences. So now, to train a transcriber on this kind of weakly labeled data, we still need some alignment. And one loss function that has such an integrated alignment step is the so-called soft dynamic time warping loss, or short SDTW. So now that we have established a pipeline for training with weak targets and soft DTW, let's take a look at the day in the life of a typical PhD student who uses these targets for his training. So the PhD student wakes up and the training is finished. Nice, it was training for hours. So the student is happy and checks the predictions, but they sound horrible. So there's so much blurring in the predictions. Some notes have a very reduced amplitude. So the student starts to think about the problem. It doesn't seem to be the network. It's the same one he's always using. Also, it's not the data. The segments are aligned precisely. So again, it must be something inside the soft dynamic time warping loss. And this loss is really complicated. Our student doesn't know what's going inside, so he doesn't know what to do. All he can do is basically adjust some hyperparameters and retrain the model. Training is taking 4 hours, so what does a typical student do during this time? Right, he sits there and stares at the screen, right? What else should he do? And while he's doing that, he starts to think, what if there was a way that we could inspect the training with soft DTW before actually training? What if we could tell something about the training success before starting the training? So let's see what we can do to help the student. If the problem is not the transcriber and not the data, then it's the loss. And if the inside of the loss is complicated, then at least we can take a look at the gradients that flow from the loss to the network, because this gives us information about how the network parameters are updated in the end. Of course, we can write this down for soft DTW, but there's an alignment step involved and 2 recursions, and the formulation is complex and it doesn't help us. So how do we help the students? In our work, we propose to reformulate the soft DTW loss. In particular, we take the internal states of the soft dynamic time warping loss and the weak targets, and we compute a virtual target representation, which we call modified targets. And now, interestingly, these modified targets have a temporal frame-wise correspondence to the predictions and to the input audio. So we can interpret the training now differently. We can interpret training with soft DTW and weak targets as training with frame-wise modified targets and an element-wise MSE loss. Note that we're not actually changing the training. It's only a way to interpret the complicated soft DTW training as easy as the training with element-wise features and an MSE loss, such as you see on the left-hand side. So if you read our paper, you will find a deep mathematical analysis of the soft DTW properties. We have some bad news for the student. So we prove that soft DTW causes blurring. Always. It's in the math. There's no way to avoid it. But now we have found a way that we can rate the amount of blurring, and we know how to control it. So let's take a look at a practical example where we want to fine-tune a pre-trained transcriber on weakly aligned data. So to do so, we train models with 2 different sets of hyperparameters, and we want to see whether we can predict the training outcome already in the initial phase. As a reminder, this is what it should sound like. So let's choose a first set of hyperparameters with a relatively high Softman temperature. And when looking at the modified targets on the left-hand side, we see that they already are quite blurred and many nodes have a reduced amplitude. Again, these are the modified targets that we computed before even starting the training. So now let's train the network and let's take a look at the final predictions on the right-hand side. Also, they have a reduced amplitude and they also sound like the modified targets. So now we were able to predict this bad training outcome before even starting the training. So now we have a tool at hand that we can use to analyze the loss. And now let's choose a second set of hyperparameters with a lower Softman temperature. Now the modified targets look nice and crisp, and they also sound good. Very cool. So let's take these good targets virtually and use them to train the network. Let's listen to the final result. So now this final result is satisfying. It's almost as good as training with strong targets. And we were able to predict this good result before we even started the training. So to summarize, we took the complicated formulation of the soft dynamic time warping loss and we mathematically computed a reformulation into a set of targets with frame-wise correspondence to the predictions. We showed that the network is indeed learning these targets during training. This visualization and representation is very natural, so we can interpret these targets. We can look at them and we can sonify them to hear what the network is finally going to learn. On the mathematical side, we provide theoretical explanations for many artifacts that are commonly found in soft dynamic time warping, such as blurring or a decay of the amplitude. Altogether, we really provide a tool to help the training and to understand the loss. So already at the beginning of training, we know what the network is learning. So thanks a lot for listening, and please meet me at the poster. Thanks.